so basically, we're done with payment. So let's go to the second mode of extinguishing obligation, which is loss of the thing due. Okay. Again, just like what we discussed earlier, kapag nawala yung isang bagay, especially due to fortuitous event, mga ganyan, uh, then that loss of that thing is kumbaga extinguishes the obligation. Ibig sabihin there is no more obligation on the part of the debtor. Okay. Here, in loss of the thing due, there is impossibility of compliance with or performance of the obligation through any cause, like like the thing perishes, goes out of commerce, disappears, and it leads to the extinguishment of obligation. Now, perishes, for example, na namatay or na pala nun, in the case of animals, namatay siya or nawala, or I mean, na pala nun, na bulok in case of yung fungibles, mga ganyan, or goes out of commerce in the case of commercially available materials, na wala na siya sa merkado. Kumbaga, soft drinks na hindi na binibenta ngayon sa market, mga ganyan, or it disappeared. Something if it disappeared due perhaps to due to fortuitous event, like nasunog, nasunog yung may parang sunog ganyan, and then nawala siya. Okay, that leads to if the thing is lost, if the thing is lost, then the obligation is extinguished. Pero hindi, again, just like what we discussed in fortuitous events, hindi lahat ng pagkakawala can lead to the extinguishment of the obligation entirely. Okay, here are the requisites. 1, the thing lost must be determinate. Again, the thing lost, kung ang nawala, this is only applicable kapag ang nawala ay a specific thing. Okay? If you're referring to a very specific thing na hindi mo na mababalik, okay, if the thing is lost because of that, ma-extinguish yung obligation. Next is, the thing was lost without the fault of the debtor. Okay. And lastly, the thing was lost before the debtor incurred delay. Okay. Nabanggit na natin yan last time, di ba? Pero again, let me reiterate, if the specific thing ay nawala because of na walang kasalanan doon yung debtor, the obligation can be extinguished. Pero what if may kasalanan si debtor? Or for example, the debt, sabi niya sa isa, thing was lost before debtor incurred delay. For example, paano kapag nagkaroon ng delay on the part of the debtor? Well, hindi niya nabigay agad on the day na kailangan, ganyan. Or after demand, hindi niya nabigay yung bagay, or meron siyang fault, meron siyang negligence, for example. Okay. Is there will the obligation of the debtor be extinguished? No. Okay? Kailangan wala siyang fault, kailangan hindi pa siya in delay at the time na nawala yung bagay. And again, the thing must be determinate. For example, may nagkaroon ng fortuitous event, pero ang obligation naman ay magbigay ng pera or magbigay ng any sack of rice, mga ganun. Those things are not really determinate. So kahit pwedeng ibigay doon na bigas or pera, mga ganyan, especially. So kung natupok yung pera, doesn't matter, kailangan mo pa rin bayaran yan kasi that thing is not determinate. Unless a very specific bill, very specific money na nag-iisa lang, na yun talaga yung subject matter, kapag nawala yun, wala nang obligation. But if it's generic money, kumbaga pera lang, in general, to a certain amount, mga ganun, yun, indeterminate yun. And kahit mawala yun, you are still obligated to give or obligated to pay your debt. So there are two types of impossibility. Meron tayong tinatawag na legal impossibility at physical impossibility. Now, yung physical impossibility, that is self-explanatory, ano? Nasabi na natin yan last time. Kung nasabi natin kanina yan, kapag nabulok yung bagay or namatay, mga ganyan, or nawala talaga, or yun yung mga physical impossibility. Ibig sabihin, physically wala na yung bagay. Physically nawala yung bagay. So it is impossible really to give you that kasi wala nga eh. Wala na siya. It's physically gone. Meron din naman tinatawag na legal impossibility wherein hindi siya ang palan nun, hindi siya technically wala pero it is immoral or dangerous. Kumbaga, for example, the obligation is to deliver drugs, mga ganyan. That is immoral, right? And that could be a legal impossibility wherein the obligation can be extinguished altogether. Mga ganun bagay. If it's dangerous, mga ganyan. Yun, if you have to sink doon sa pinakamalalim na portion ng ocean para makuha yon, mga ganon, it's legally impossible. Hindi siya physically impossible kasi pwede mo namang, there is a chance that you can get there, but it's legally impossible kasi it could be dangerous to the person. So because of that, the obligation can be extinguished. Okay, if it's legally impossible or physically impossible, no obligation anymore. Okay, so that is loss of the thing due. Okay. The next mode of extinguishing obligation is condonation or remission of debt. Simple lang to. Pinatawad yung utang. Kumbaga, hindi na siningil. Okay. Here, condonation is called an act of liberality by virtue of which the obligee, without receiving any price or equivalent, renounces the enforcement of the obligation. Kumbaga, it is an act of liberality. It is an act of generosity where yung creditor need not receive any price doon sa debt at pinapatawad niya na kumbaga yung utang. That is one way of extinguishing obligation. Siyempre, kapag pinatawad ka na, wala ka na obligation, tama? Except, unlike payment, sa payment kasi may binibigay ka pa, dito sa condonation, wala. Okay. What are the requisites for valid condonation? First, it must be gratuitous. Dapat, kailangan act of generosity nga. Kailangan act of gratuity. Kumbaga parang libre, walang kapalit. Okay? Also, it must be accepted by the obligor or in this case, the debtor. Kung sino yung debtor, okay, ganito yun kapag hindi ka na siningil, kailangan merong acceptance. Okay? You need to accept yung pagpapatawad niya ng utang mo. Of course, if ikaw yung nakautang tapos papatawarin na yung utang mo, alam ka namang di mo i-accept, di ba? But still, that is accepted. That needs to be accepted. Kasi meron din mga tao naman na hindi rin naman talaga nila tinatanggap yung mga ganyan, mga condonation, yung remission ng debt. For pride reasons, mga ganyan. Pero generally, tinatanggap naman ng debtor. Wala ka namang libre na nga, hindi mo patatanggapin, di ba? Anyway, and the obligation must be demandable. Sabi dyan, kailangan demandable na yung obligation. Kumbaga, due na. Dapat nang bayaran based dun sa obligation, Okay. Now, here in condonation or remission of debt, the expected result is total or partial extinguishment. Pwedeng yung pinatawad niya lang, for example, ay yung interest lang, or pwedeng 50%, sige, bayaran mo na lang yung kalahati na lang bayaran mo doon. Yung iba, mo na lang yan, pang merienda mo or what, di ba? Or it could be total. Pwedeng yung kabuuan ng utang, sige na, ayaw mo na. Huwag mo nang bayaran. Okay? So it could be partial, it could be total. yung condonation. Like, for example, meron kang utang na 1 million sa akin, yung total, kumbaga yung 1 million, sige na, nabayaran yung 1 million. Kung yung partial, kumbaga, sige, tulong ko na sa iyo yung 100,000, basta balik mo sa akin yung 900,000 ko. Okay, again, you as the debtor, you need to accept that. Kasi para siyang, this is correlated doon sa idea ng donation also in civil code where uh, the donation must be accepted by the donee. Okay? Yung donor, pag binigyan ka ng donor ng property or what, the donee needs to receive it. The donee needs to accept it rather. So yan. This is condonation. Simple lang. Okay. The next part is on confusion or merger. Now, bear with me kasi this is confusing by the name itself. But in confusion or merger, in confusion, there is, these are the same thing. Merger of the characters of the creditor and debtor in one and the same person, by virtue of which the obligation is extinguished. Kumbaga, you are your own creditor. Kumbaga, ikaw ang debtor, ikaw din ang creditor. Weird, right? Bakit mo nang papautangan ng sarili mo? But there is a logical dito. Example later, which you will see. The requisites of confusion or merger are, first, there is a merger of characters of the debtor and creditor, and it must be in the same person. Kumbaga, you're referring to just one and the same person, creditor and debtor of the same person. Okay. Next must take place in the person of either the principal creditor or the principal debtor, and the confusion or merger must be complete. Okay. I don't think there's an easy way for me to discuss this, pero siguro ganito. A good example here is yung tinatawag natin na promissory note. Okay? Promissory note is a negotiable instrument. Ano? So in promissory note, you write there na I promise to pay ganto the amount of 1,000. Mga ganun. So to simplify it, parang ganun. Yung promissory note mo ay I promise to pay ganto a sum of 1,000. Okay. Now, ikaw na debtor, binigay mo yun sa creditor mo. Ngayon, yung creditor mo, dahil may utang din siya, pinambayad niya yung promissory note mo. That is possible. That is possible sa negotiable instruments. But negotiable instruments is really a confusing topic, and we can discuss it siguro if I'm still your nego teacher. Pero, yun. The negotiable instrument is passed from your creditor to another person until the last person who is holding your negotiable instruments, ginamit yun na pambayad sa'yo. Okay? Kumbaga yung negotiable yung promissory note mo, bumalik lang din sa'yo. So there's a confusion there already, Ikaw yung debtor in a sense na ikaw yung nag-issue nung yung promissory note. Pero ikaw din yung creditor kasi yung taong last na may hawak ng promissory note, may utang sa'yo. So, creditor ka in that sense. Pero ikaw lang din naman ang magbabayad nun. Kasi, under the promissory note, ikaw yung may utang. Okay? So, kapag nakabalik sa'yo yung promissory note mo, break even ka na. Kumbaga, nagpautang ka, kung magkano yung nakalagay doon sa promissory note, at kung magkano yung binalik sa'yo as value ng promissory note, same lang yun. So, you are a debtor and at the same time a creditor of yourself doon. So, basically, in that case, may extinguish yung obligation mo kasi yung mga succeeding na holders nung promissory note, it ended up with you. Napunta sa'yo, kumbaga creditor ka doon, pero at the same time, because you issued yung promissory note, you are also the debtor. So, dahil doon nagkaroon na ng confusion nagkaroon na ng fusion yung role mo as creditor at debtor in that instance, there is already confusion. And because there is confusion, there is there is your obligation, the obligation is extinguished. Okay. Uh, Another mode of extinguishing obligations is compensation. So far we have discussed payment, loss of the thing due, uh, remission or condonation of the debt, merger or confusion, and here the fifth one is compensation. So dito naman sa compensation, it is a mode of extinguishing in their concurrent amount those obligations of persons who in their own right are creditors and debtors of each other. Okay. Remember, kanina sa confusion or merger, you are the debtor and creditor of yourself. Pero this time, in compensation, meron ng isang debtor at isang creditor. Hiwalay na sila. Dalawa na 'yon. Dalawang magkaibang tao 'yon. Uh, so here, kaya lang ang kaibahan sa regular na payment, for example, is in compensation, si debtor ay creditor, si debtor at creditor are debtors and creditors of each other. Kumbaga si kuwari ako tapos ikaw, okay? May utang ka sa akin, so you are my debtor, ako yung creditor, di ba? Pero ako, may utang din ako sa'yo. So in that case, may debtor ako, ikaw ang creditor. Okay. What compensation is saying is that pwedeng ma-cancel out yung utang ko ng utang mo. And yung utang mo ng utang ko. Kung baka for example, nakautang ako sa'yo ng 500, may utang ka rin sa akin ng may utang ako sa'yo ng 500, may utang ka sa akin ng 500, cancel out. Ganun yung idea ng compensation. But in order for compensation to be to work, the debts must be liquidated. Kailangan liquidated muna yung debt. You already know what liquidated is, 'di ba? Based siguro on your sa accounting niyo. That both debts must be liquidated. Compensation, in a sense, can be legal, voluntary, or judicial. Okay. Merong mga klase ng compensation na by operation of law. Kumbaga, sinasabi ng batas na mismo na pwedeng sinasabi na mismo ng batas na ito pag ganitong arrangement maka-cancel out na yung utang niyong dalawa. That's legal. Meron naman tinatawag na voluntary compensation wherein you agree among yourselves since may utang ka sa akin na 500 but may utang rin ako sa'yo na 500, pwede bang quits na lang tayo? Yun, voluntary yun in a sense na you agreed among you and your debtor or creditor na isettle nyo ng dalawa na okay, quits na tayo. Voluntary yan. But there are also compensations which are considered as judicial. Sa judicial naman, yung court na mismo ang nagdikta. Ito na. Since ikaw, creditor mo siya, ikaw, creditor ka rin niya, na lang kayo. Mag-break even na lang kayo or sige, bilang may utang siyang 800, ikaw 500, di cancel out mo na yung 500, 300 na lang bayaran mo. That's the order of the court, that is judicial. Pero if you agree, again, if it's legal, sinasabi ng batas mismo na magkakaroon ng compensation. Sa voluntary, you agree between and among yourselves. At yung judicial, kapag inutos ng court. Alright? So, that's the simple explanation when it comes to compensation. Okay, and the last mode under yung sa enumeration natin kanina is novation. So, here in novation, 'di ba? Kaya dun sa payment, if you remember sa payment, na-extinguish ang obligation kasi binayaran, 'di ba? Yung amount. Sa loss of the thing due dahil sinabi ng batas na na wala ng obligation kapag nawala yung bagay because of say fortuitous event, wala ma-extinguish yung obligation, di ba? Sa remission or condonation of the debt, walang ginawa pero parang because of the generosity, because of yung generosity nung nung creditor, kinancel out niya na lang yung parang dinonate niya na lang, or parang kinancel niya na yung utang ng walang kapalit, kaya na-extinguish yung obligation. In confusion or merger, dahil si debtor ay creditor din ng kanyang sarili, kumbaga umikot na sa kanya yung transaction, bumalik na sa kanya, and that makes him or her that makes him or her the creditor and debtor of himself, kaya nakakancel yung obligation. In compensation, dahil yung dalawang tao, in this case, dalawang tao ay creditors and debtors of each other, at pwede namang i-cancel out yung utang ng dalawa, kaya na extinguish ang obligation. Here, innovation, this is somehow different dun sa ibang klase ng modes of extinguishing obligation. Kasi dito, innovation, you are extinguishing the old obligation, pero you are creating another. Okay? In essence, dito sa novation, merong modification lang ng obligation, okay, which is tantamount to extinguishing yung old obligation and creating a new one. Ano yung mga klase ng modification of obligation under novation? Pwedeng yung nagpalit ng object or principal conditions. Pwedeng pinalitan yung object ng obligation, yung prestation, kumbaga pinalitan 'yon, or yung principal na conditions ng obligation, or pinalitan yung debtor, nag-substitute ng tao para sa in place ng debtor. Kumbaga, dati ako yung nangutang, napalitan na nung isa, pinalitan ako, because of the creditor or because of the debtor, sinabi na, instead of me, siya na lang yung magkakaroon ng utang. Parang ganon. So basically here, nawawala yung original na usapan, nawawala yung original na obligation, napapalitan ng panibago. The same thing with yung changing the object or principal conditions. Kumbaga, yung main thing na kailangan na i-deliver, for example, na or yung something na kailangan i-perform, napapalitan. So basically yung old na obligation, mawawala na siya at mapapalitan ng bago. And finally, sa next is yung last is subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. Kung yung kung yung isa napalitan object, yung isa napalitan yung debtor, sa pangatlo ang napalitan naman yung creditor. Kumbaga si creditor na-substitutan ng panibagong tao. That could happen, and those are types of modifications that may be considered as novation. Okay. In novation, gaya nga nasabi ko kanina, na-extinguish ang obligation, yes. Pare-pareho yan kasi nga modes of extinguishing obligation nga ito. But there is a creation of a new obligation. Unlike yung sa mga naunang lima na walang nakikreate na bagong obligation, here innovation, merong bagong na-create na obligation. Why? Kasi nga ang point nga ng novation is you remove the first obligation, you abrogate the first obligation, tinatanggal mo yung first na obligation by substituting it with another. Kumbaga, either by palitan mo yung object, palitan mo yung debtor, or palitan mo yung creditor. Okay. In order for it to be considered as novation, there must be first, previous valid obligation. Dapat meron yung unang obligation, yung old, valid dapat yon. Next, there is agreement between the parties of the new obligation. Kailangan may agreement yung dalawang parties na bubuo na lang sila ng panibagong obligation. Third, dapat yung yung bagong agreement must extinguish the old obligation. Kumbaga parang hindi kasi compatible yung una at pangalawang obligation, kaya tatanggalin yung old, papalit yung new. At lastly, kailangan valid yung bagong obligation. Kumbaga, obligation A, okay, you make it into obligation B. Ma-extinguish si A, lalabas si bagong obligation. Itong bagong obligation can be, gaya nga ng sabi natin kanina, bago yung object niya, bago yung debtor niya, or bago yung creditor niya. Ano? In which case, all of these are kinds of novation anyway. Ano? Pero kailangan itong second na obligation must be first agreed upon. Pinag-agrihan nung dalawang parties itong new obligation na to. And second, it must be valid. Kailangan itong second obligation na to, valid dapat siya. Kasi if this is not valid, there is no valid novation. Okay? So yan. Novation may be expressed or implied, but again pero kailangan usually novation is expressed. Okay? Kailangan it is agreed upon by the parties. Kailangan merong kailangan napag-agrihan nila na magkakaroon ng novation, magkakaroon ng change in the obligation from the old to the new. It must be expressed. Pero may mga instances na the novation is implied. Ibig sabihin, yung pagbabago ng obligation ay hindi nila sinabing bagong obligation na siya, pero in essence, ganun na nga. Parang ganun na nga. Okay. Pero kapag implied, ang mas mahirap kasi kapag when we speak of implied, kailangan mong i-establish yung incompatibility ng dalawang obligation, yung old at new. Okay? Dapat itong old at new, hindi sila compatible sa isa't isa. Hindi sila, let's say, they cannot coexist. Hindi dapat sila pwedeng mag-survive ng sabay. So, there must be incompatibility between the old obligation and the new obligation. Okay? So, that is implied. Although, again, mas common yung express na novation, express na change. Okay, from the old to the new. Okay. Now, in order for novation, para makita mo if there is actually novation or if there is novation or not, there must be what is called yung animus novandi. Ibig sabihin, the parties have the intention to substitute a new obligation in place of the old one. Kumbaga, merong intention yung dalawang parties na palitan yung from the old obligation to the new. Okay. It must be clearly established before there can be novation resulting in the extinguishment of the old obligation and the creation of a new one. Kailangan malinaw na ma-establish either expressly or impliedly na kailangan malinaw na meron na gusto ng mga parties na magkaroon ng change doon sa obligation. In a sense na ma-extinguish yung isa, maka-create yung isa. Okay? Because if there is no intention na i-substitute yung old sa new, it might be na dalawang magkahiwalay na kontrata yan, 'di ba? So here, in order para sigurado ka na ma-extinguish yung old obligation at magkakaroon ng panibago, there must be what we call animus novandi. There must be an intent to novate, or there's an intent to change from the old obligation to the new one. Okay? So that is novation. So just a quick recap. Meron tayo under yung sa natin, under sa enumeration natin kanina, which is an article in the civil code, in the law on obligations and contracts, we have payment, loss of the thing due, condonation or remission of the debt, merger or confusion, compensation, and novation. These are the modes of extinguishing obligation. Sana malinaw sa atin yung distinction. Sa payment, you pay. You pay your obligation, it's extinguished. That's the most simple of them all. Pero may special forms ng payment, datation in payment, cession, application of payments, mga ganun. Okay? So, in application of payments, pipiliin ni creditor kung saan nilalagay yung payment kasi kulang to cover all of your debts kasi marami sila. In session, i-surrender mo yung properties mo para para yung proceeds niya pumunta dun sa mga sa mga creditors mo. Indation in pago, you pay with a thing. Okay? Yan. So, loss of the thing due again, if it's lost and it's not generic, it's the obligation extinguished, and so on. Okay? So, this is this is a big chunk of the discussion. So, uh, I hope you understood yung differences between the different modes of extinguishing obligation. So for next meeting, we will be discussing contracts. Thank you. Good evening.